2. A brief overview of the phenomenology of spirit. Hegel's phenomenology is best described as the journey above Plato's divided line, out of the cave of illusion, from sense individuals to representations to thought universals, finally to the one absolute concept which alone is reality. The main goal is the absolute concept, absolute knowledge, and the logic of absolute science. A second goal, as we'll see, is Reich Gottes, or kingdom come, and the end of history. Thus, the phenomenology's itinerary simply traces the stages of the realization of the concept and absolute knowing. In passing, we must note that since the concept, which is alone reality, is thought, those realist Hegelians who hold that for Hegel, nature and the world is reality and not thought, are absolutely in error. Hegel is an idealist, not a realist. As he says at Encyclopedia 160, quote, "The standpoint of the concept is absolute idealism, and all else that counts as independent is known within the concept simply as an ideal moment," end quote. Also at Encyclopedia 381, he states that, quote, "Nature has vanished. It is simply ideal," end quote. Before we take a brief look at the stages that lead up to the absolute concept, two things. First, one of the keys to the phenomenology is certainty, Gewissheit, a cognate of knowing, Wissen. We move from sense certainty to self-certainty and end with absolute certainty or knowing. Second, we must state that just as Richard Winfield has cracked the code to Hegel's science of logic, it is our view that John Stewart has similarly cracked the code to Hegel's phenomenology in his book, The Unity of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. In brief, Hegel left us a code for understanding the phenomenology in his table of contents. For example, in the major ABC and AABBCCDD divisions of the work. I will just quote one of Hegel's passages that will make this crystal clear. It appears in section B of the CAA Reason chapter. Quote, "Just as reason, in the role of observer, repeated in the element of the category the movement of A consciousness, namely sense certainty, perception, and the understanding, so will reason again run through the double movement of B self-consciousness and pass over from independence into its freedom," end quote. So I strongly advise everyone to read this book. The first stage of the journey that leads to the absolute concept is A, consciousness. That is, consciousness of an other. The main ABC stages of the book are A, consciousness, B, self-consciousness, and C, which is untitled, but whose first section is AA, reason. In effect, we move from consciousness of an other to consciousness of consciousness or self, to the unity of consciousness and self-consciousness, which has four forms, the first of which is reason, then spirit, then religion, and lastly, absolute knowledge. The move from consciousness to self-consciousness and the concept signifies not only a major step in exiting Plato's cave, but also that we are, in a sense, at the end of the book. For we now know that consciousness, the concept or thought, is reality. All that remains to do is to harvest or assimilate all remaining objects, other selves, the world, God, into the concept, which then becomes the absolute concept. Okay, in brief, A, consciousness has three stages or shapes of consciousness: sense certainty, perception, and understanding, whose respective independent objects, or not I's, are the this, the thing, and forces and laws. Here we will watch how the dialectical experience will negate these objects and show how they reveal their truth to be consciousness and the concept. Next, B, self-consciousness, which also harbors consciousness, has as its goal their unification. It is first desire, which seeks to validate itself by negating, consuming its object, life. When this fails, it turns to an object in which it can see itself, another self-consciousness, which leads to recognition and the master-slave dialectic, which ends in the freedom of self-consciousness and its three forms: stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness. When the priest connects the latter with its unchangeable absolute other, we have a unity Hegel calls CAA, reason, which is, quote, the conscious certainty of being all reality, end quote. Here, reason will start from its immediacy and gradually actualize itself as all reality and become spirit. It will do this via an observing reason that observes nature and self-consciousness, an active reason that seeks its happiness via pleasure, the law of its heart, and the pursuit of virtue, and a practical reason that engages in the matter in hand and the giving and testing of laws. The dialectic next takes us into CBB, spirit, which is implicitly the unity of the self and the world. Here we have actual historical spirits from which all that preceded were abstractions. Spirit begins again in its immediacy, and we watch the spirit actualize itself in three stages. A, true spirit, Greek and Roman. B, self-alienated spirit, medieval and modern. And C, spirit certain of itself, Kantian and Fichtean morality. The key here is the unity of the universal, the Greek ethical spirit, and the individual, the modern moral spirit, or UI, which signifies spirit actualized, the kingdom of God, and the end of history. It is a recognition and reconciliation of selves, which Hegel describes as, quote, God appearing in the form of those who know themselves as pure knowledge, end quote. Briefly, in A, we see how the harmony of the Greek immediate spirit collapses via Antigone. In B, we trace the progress of spirit's self-alienation in the wealth and politics of culture, in the social critique of the disrupted hippie consciousness, Rameau's nephew, in the clash of faith and insight, or enlightenment, which came to a head in utility, and the absolute freedom and terror of the French Revolution. Finally, in C, we move from France to Germany and the actualization of spirit. First, in Kantian morality, where we have a dualism which ought not to be. Kant has the universal, but not the individual. Hence, no recognition of selves. And then in Fichtean and romantic conscience, where acting and judging conscience forgive each other, resulting in a recognition that is God and kingdom come. Next, having actualized spirit as God, we advance to C, religion. The need here is to bring religion's object, God, into the one absolute concept. This is accomplished in the three phases of natural religion, religion in the form of art, and the revealed religion, a religion in whose object we can see ourselves, and which Hegel calls the absolute religion, as expressing the truth of the unity of human and divine, the finite and the infinite. All that now remains is to give religion's truth the true form of the concept, which happens in CDD, absolute knowledge or knowing, in which we first have a summary of the stages of the phenomenology, culminating in absolute knowledge or the absolute concept, which occurs with the unification of morality's form and religion's content. We are finally out of the cave for good. Absolute knowledge, Hegel tells us, is, quote, the knowledge of the self's act within itself as all essentiality and all existence. And it happens when the spirit gives its complete and true content the form of the self, and thereby realizes its concept as remaining in its concept in this realization, end quote. Hegel ends his Phenomenology and Introduction to Absolute Science with a glance at what is to come, the sciences of logic, nature, and spirit.